Welcome to the first webinar of CoAsia webinar series for 2023. We are happy to host Emre Demir as our first speaker for this year. Today, he will give a talk on his recently published first book. Emre Demir got his BA degree in economics from Ankara University in 2007. He received an MA degree in international relations from the same university in 2010, and he got his second MA degree in international politics and East Asia from the University of Warwick in 2014. Finally, Demir got his PhD in international relations from the Middle East Technical University in 2019. Emre Demir worked as a researcher at the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, TEPAL, between 2009 and 2012. In 2012, he joined TED University Department of Political Science and International Relations as a research assistant. And as part of his PhD research, he worked as a visiting researcher at Peking University World History Department in 2017 and 2018. Since December 2019, he works as an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at TED University in Ankara. Emre has published many research articles, book chapters, and opinion pieces. His first book, titled Contemporary China in Anglo-American and Chinese Perspectives, Making Sense of a Rising China, is recently published by Routledge. We are happy to host his first book talk at CoAsia. Today's talk will have two parts. Following Emre's presentation, we'll have a quick Q&A session. Emre, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hocam. I'm very happy to give this first book talk for Koç University Asia Studies program. And thank you very much for inviting me. I just recently, just like logging in to the webinar, I just received the first copy of my book. So it's coincidence that I will be presenting the book with the actual book in my hands. So I will make a presentation in the first part, as Burak just said, and then we will continue with the Q&A sessions. I will try my best actually to keep this short. Therefore, there will be, of course, many, let's say, gaps in my talk, so we can fill them while during the Q&A session. So this book is based on my PhD thesis. The name was slightly different. It was Making Sense of a Rising China, Perspectives from Anglo-American and Chinese Perspectives. But to make it more catchy, Routledge proposed me to, let's say, change it to Contemporary China in Anglo-American and Chinese Perspectives, Making Sense of a Rising China. As can be seen from the name of the book, actually this book is trying to understand the concept of phenomenon of the rising China, or how does rising China or China's rise is perceived by different perspectives. So North American perspectives, but like English language speaking North American perspectives and Chinese perspectives. The outline shows us the table of contents of the book, and like after an introduction that I discuss, and I will be talking about it also, that I discuss the concept of hegemony and how like Eurocentric the concept is, etc. Then we move on with the mainstream US conceptions of rising of China. So I divide the book into two, and each part is divided into two as well. So we have Anglo-American perspectives and we have Chinese perspectives. And both of these perspectives are divided into mainstream and critical perspectives. And from them, we have different approaches to each thing. So mainstream US conception is divided into three, as we will see. So two realist and one neoliberal perspective. Critical Anglo-American conception is divided into two as well: world systems analysis and like Coxian Gramscian approach or historical materialist critical theory. Mainstream Chinese conception is divided into three. We have the Tianxia approach of Zhao Tingyang, moral realism of Yan Xuetong, and relational theory of world politics of Qin Yaqing. And finally, critical and neoconservative Chinese conceptions are divided into primarily two parts. So like the New Left and the neoconservative or neo-Confucianism thought, but they are also divided into some sub-branches. But we will not go into details of each, of course, perspective, because it will be taking too long if you do that. So let's continue with the introduction. So this book, as I said, is based on my PhD thesis. And when I started my PhD thesis, actually the topic was different, as like many of us have experienced. We start with another topic and end up with something else. And while doing that, actually, I had the privilege of getting support of many scholars, both my PhD supervisors and members of the thesis committee. So I would like to thank them before starting. So I would like to first of all thank Ceren Ergenç and Derya Göçer. So Ceren Hoca was my first PhD thesis advisor, but because she had to go to China, then she transferred me to Derya Göçer from Middle East Technical University again, and both of them helped me a lot. So I'm very indebted to both Derya Hoca and Ceren Hoca. But I'm also indebted to Seriye Sezen, Pınar Bedirhanoğlu, and Şerif Onur Bahçecik for their comments during the preparation of the book and during the thesis defense. And also I need to thank Pınar Hoca for her very critical touch on the thesis, which led to this book in the end. And I also need to thank Corinne Esterman for her help in proofreading of the book. So let me continue with the introduction. So as I said, this book was based on the concept of hegemony. So I was more engaged in hegemony debates. I was reading on that and trying to work on this concept previously during my PhD studies. Since then, I'm not working on the concept anymore, but the book that therefore based on this concept of hegemony, how hegemony is conceptualized in the IR discipline, and how it changed throughout the years, especially since the 60s and 70s, and based on this different conceptualization of hegemony, and based on, of course, historical developments, how the existing hegemon, its evaluation, and its challengers are viewed by the different perspectives. Therefore, I look for the debates on the fall of the US hegemony and the rise of China because of that in this book, as well as in the introduction. And here ontology is very important, and Robert Koch says that ontology lies at the beginning of any inquiry, and Zizek says that every ontology is political. And from this, we say that, and I follow Cox's famous phrase, theory is always for someone and for some purpose. And this actually, sentence is the basis of this book. So I am trying to understand which of these, or how these theories that I look at, or how these perspectives that I look at in this book are actually created for whom and with which purpose. So this is the basis of the book. While doing this, following Christensen and Fichtner, I divide the social sciences and the structure of the social sciences into three: core, semi-periphery, and periphery. So core is represented by the US or American IR, semi-periphery is represented by Western European IR, and the rest actually, or non-Western IR, makes the periphery. So a huge bunch of social sciences committees, intellectuals, scholars are a part of this periphery, including Turkey, of course. And following Brovoy, I define 4 types of knowledge and produced for 3 audiences. So we have instrumental knowledge and reflexive knowledge. I will not go into details of these things very much to keep it short, but instrumental knowledge is divided into professional and policy, and reflexive knowledge is divided into critical and public. And all knowledge are created either for an academic audience or for extra academic audience that can be divided into 2: professionals or like policymakers and the public. So each intellectual knowledge production speaks to at least one of these audiences, and of course it is related with knowledge production and power relations linkage. When we look at the literature on hegemony and how this China's rise is perceived in the literature, so the literature is dominated by Western approaches, and among them mainstream US IR approaches of course dominate the field, and their knowledge production is instrumental knowledge. So it is produced not to debate or to criticize the existing structure, but to help actually to reinforce the existing structure. Critical Western approaches, on the other hand, claim to be reflexive and critical, as their name implies. But we will talk about how critical they are or how successful they are in criticizing the existing system and the mainstream USIR approaches. Some common problems, these both mainstream and critical IR approaches have some common problems. First of all, they are all Western-centric, I claim, including Robert Cox's or Wallerstein's approaches. I claim that they are Western-centric. So they disregard the legacies of colonialism and imperialism. This is, of course, mainly the case for the mainstream US IR approaches, but up to a degree, or I say that the critical ones do not engage in this debate of colonialism and imperialism as they should be, I claim. They are all Westphalian system-centered, so they are nation states. So they have this problem of nation state centrism. We can say that Wallerstein and world system analysis actually is against that. That's why they say that they are against nation states as units, and that's why they talk about the world system. And they exclusively rely on Western thinkers and Western philosophers. They disregard the contribution of non-Western philosophers and thinkers, and their knowledge production is region-centric and centered on Western locality. Therefore, both critical and mainstream USIR approaches strengthen the existing unequal power structures, I claim. That's why, this was criticized by Pınar Bediranoğlu because of this approach very much. When we look at the Western centrism in the IR discipline, we see that it's based on colonial and imperial reasoning, and their colonial and imperial reasoning, and this is also, especially the case for mainstream IR, we see that they are stuck in the orthodox conceptualization of colonialism, which claims that colonialism is a thing of the past, because they focus on colonialism as a type of rule, like the domination of foreigners or the foreigners dominating a local community. But Saurin claims that this is the illusion of this creates the illusion of a post-imperial world order. However, when we look at the orthodox thinking, we see that colonialism is not only a thing, is not a thing of the past, because we shouldn't be only focusing on the or evaluating the concept as in the orthodox approach, but we should be seeing that colonialism as an idea is not a thing of the past. It is still with us, and it is actually strengthened by capitalist imperialism. Therefore, we cannot say that colonialism is a thing of the past, and therefore we should be analyzing the world through a colonialist or through thinking about colonialism as well as imperialism. And this imperialist thinking, actually, that Western, especially mainstream IR has, dominates knowledge production. It universalizes its version of the truth and hinders non-Western histories and experiences, and this way limits alternative thinking in IR and in general in social sciences. So because of this imperialist thinking, which dominate knowledge production, and which actually because of that is used to all of us, because I mean in the book also, but in my thesis I was saying I started with this like idea that I am very much indoctrinated in this imperialist thinking. Therefore, it's very hard to overcome this idea. And therefore, to fix this problem, we must decolonize IR. And for that, we need to have a comparative and historical perspective that not only focuses on the Western experiences, but also like searches for non-Western experiences as well. We should be questioning the ontology, history, and methods of IR, and this way undertaking we need to undertake the political economy of knowledge production. But this, of course, requires like a strong political economic background to support all this intellectual endeavor. So I have the two research questions of this book are as follows. So the first one is, what can be learned about the heterogeneity of knowledge production from the contributions of mainstream and critical Western and Chinese approaches to the debate on a rapidly transforming and rising China? So I say that we cannot, I mean, there is no homogeneity in knowledge production, and we have to overcome this Western-centrism. Therefore, we need to learn from non-Western approaches as well. And since I cannot look at like numerous approaches, I like prefer to choose Western and Chinese approaches. And the second question is, what is to be learned from this same discussion about the relationship between power and knowledge production in social sciences and the region-centricity of knowledge production efforts? So by looking at this same debate on rising China, we can see the link between power and knowledge production, both in the Western and in Chinese contexts, and we can understand the region-centricity or locality of knowledge production efforts. And in this precise book, I look at, of course, North American or Anglo-American and Chinese centricity. I mean, the case is China and China-US relations. So why I chose these, of course, I mean, why I centered my research on China. First of all, I'm working on China, but also China is on the spotlight, right? So everyone is talking about China. When even we, like when Russia started its invasion of Ukraine, for example, people also talked about China. Like as much as Russia is debated among the Western media, among Western elites, intellectuals, we see that China is debated as much as Russia. Therefore, China is in the spotlight and everyone is talking about China. Unfortunately, Turkey is not talking as much as it needs to normally. And as the Chinese economy, political economy, and society is transformed since the 1980s, we see that there are efforts in the Chinese academia for creating a homegrown theorizing. Therefore, I wanted to look at Chinese international relations perspectives. Then I widen it to in general social sciences production. And from this, I wanted to see how Chinese view themselves, because like, as I said before, international relations discipline and literature is very much dominated by Western approaches, Western evaluations of China, but I wanted to look at how Chinese view themselves, and because it offers us an important new kind of information about the country. I will very briefly talk about like these four conceptions of rising China, starting with the mainstream US conceptions, then Western critical ones, then I will continue with mainstream Chinese and critical Chinese, and I will we have a longer session or devote a longer time for the conclusion. So with the end of the Cold War, as we all know, like there was this famous claim by Francis Fukuyama that this is the end of history. So democracy, liberal democracy, could beat its main rival, like socialism, and this way there is no challenge to the dominance of liberal democracy. But just a few years after this end of history thesis, many American scholars or US scholars started to actually see China as a threat to the US dominance in world politics. I will not go into details of that. And because of that, like many Western scholars started to talk about China as being a possible challenger to the US leadership in world political economy. And because of that, a renewed interest in the United States, I mean, there was a renewed interest in the United States on the concept of hegemony. So how can hegemony be described? How should it be described? What is the relationship between a hegemonic power and its possible challenger or challengers? How does hegemonic transition happen? And based on these debates, how can the US-China relations be analyzed, or how should it be analyzed? And mainstream IR provides to these debates, of course, a US-centric perspective with the intention of supporting the United States state while hindering the rise of China. So the main idea is to limit or to prevent China's rise by supporting the US state through intellectual contributions. Therefore, I say that these three approaches that I look at here, so post-classical realism, offensive realism, and neoliberal institutionalism, they are theories of stability. They theorize to stabilize the existing system and the dominance of United States or centrality of United States in this system. And their primary focus on while evaluating China's rise is the official documents and declarations of Chinese officials, because they are state-centered approaches. So when we look at realist approaches, and these two, post-classical realism and offensive realism, we see that realists are in general pessimists regarding China. Since the early 1990s, the scholars say that China will be the primary contender. They say it more and more these days. And one of the leading figures, John Mearsheimer, says since the 90s has been saying that China cannot rise peacefully. Therefore, the United States should balance China's rise as an offshore balancer. Neoliberal institutionalists, on the other hand, are in general optimists regarding China. So compared to realists, they say that China can be engaged to the international system peacefully. It doesn't have to rise as a challenger that threatens the lead of the United States. It doesn't have to be the case. And Ian Johnston was claiming that it is very hard to find clear-cut evidence for claims for China's revisionism in the 2000s. He was claiming this. So in general, the liberals were saying that China can be engaged peacefully into the international system, but we need to tame China so that they will not be revisionists in the end. When we look at the critical approaches of international relations, of course, they are critical. They are called as critical because they criticize mainstream international relations theories, primarily neorealism and neoliberalism. So these approaches object claims to universality, neutrality, and value freeness of mainstream IR. They try to reveal the deep and close relationship between knowledge production and power structures. And they aim to overcome the unequal spatial distribution of knowledge production in the world. So Emanuel Wallerstein, who is the leading figure of world systems analysis, proposes the creation of a multiplicity of universalisms through historicizing intellectual analysis. Robert Cox, on the other hand, who is the leading figure of historical materials critical theory or Gramscian approach, he offers historicizing intellectual analysis for creating an alternative order that grounds on multiculturalism. So multiplicity or multiculturalism are the primary motivations of these two scholars and their approaches to international relations. But we need to ask how successful these approaches and these two leading figures were in fulfilling their aims of overcoming the unequal spatial distribution of knowledge production in international relations. And I will answer this question in conclusion, in the concluding part. But let's see how world systems analysis scholars and how Gramscian approach viewed rising China. And normally in the book, I look at a number of different scholars and their evaluations of China. But here I took two most prominent ones. So Giovanni Arrighi was my preferred option for the world systems analysis. And for the historical materials critical approach, I will give a general overview of the approach. So Arrighi can be regarded as the most optimistic, actually, world systems analysis scholars. Of course, the last time he was writing on China was the 2000s, so it's a bit different. Like since then, many things changed in China as well as in China's relationship with the rest of the world. But he proposed us three possible scenarios regarding the future of the world system. So he said that there can be a joint endeavor of Western great powers for building a world empire. The second possible option was the emergence of an East Asia-centered world society. Or finally, there could be a permanent systemic chaos in which no state or society will have the capacity to lead the system, and therefore, this will create a chaotic world order without an order, actually. And he was saying that because of the last 200 years, the Industrial Revolution and the following decades, the world no longer possesses the resources necessary to continue with the Western development path. Therefore, as humanity, we need to find a new development path, because this cannot be sustained, especially when we think about China, 1.4 billion Chinese people, and more importantly, the inclusion of India in the same development path, which has a rapidly increasing population, which is about to surpass the Chinese population. Therefore, Arrighi says we need to create or build a more egalitarian and ecologically and socially sustainable new order. It needs to be a just order, but we need to be living in harmony with the nature. Otherwise, we will create the conditions of the downfall of humanity or life on Earth. he was saying. And to do that, Western development path needs to converge with the East Asian path, Arigi was saying. And he was saying that China is the most likely candidate to be the center of an East Asia-centered world market society. So he was hoping that the second possible scenario, which is the emergence of an East Asia-centered world society, would be created, and China would be the center of this East Asian world market society, which would be more egalitarian and ecologically and socially sustainable, according to him. When we look at the scholars of historical materials critical theory, we see that they are quite skeptical about the likelihood of China becoming the next hegemonic power in a new, more egalitarian world order, unlike Arigi was. So these scholars do not have consensus on the product. I mean, they have consensus on the productive and financial capability of China in attracting other states. So they say that China has, like, because of its huge productive and financial capacity, other countries might might follow China's lead, but this lead cannot be sustained in the long term, because in terms of ideations, China cannot be attractive to other societies. Therefore, they claim that neither China nor any other country are in a position to build hegemony, and therefore we won't be seeing another hegemonic order in the coming era, they were claiming. So let's move on with the mainstream Chinese conceptions of a rising China. So similar to what actually mainstream Western scholars are doing, mainstream Chinese scholars are offering lessons for their own party elite, or for the Chinese ruling elite. So they have a similar position in terms of their relationship with the state and in this power knowledge production linkage. So modernization theory, when we look at the modernization theory, we say that modernization theory claims that non-Western societies need to follow the Western modernization path to be able to develop themselves. So there is only one solution to underdevelopment, and that's the following of Western modernization. If you follow, or if you do what the Westerners did in the past, you can be developing your economy as they could, modernization theory claims. But we see that the Chinese trajectory challenges this universality claim of the Western modernization experience and the modernization theory's claims. And a similar process has been going on for some time in the world of ideas as well. So since the 80s especially, so the Chinese are creating more and more ideas to evaluate their own society, their society's relations with the outside world, and the international system as a whole. And for the Chinese ruling elite, China's rise brings with it the need to create a way of thinking in Chinese terms. So they say that we should be evaluating the world through our own terms rather than relying on exclusively on Western concepts. And of course, this creates problems for the validity of universal truths and values. So the Chinese elite want to debate, actually, or open the universality of Western-centric thinking into question. We see this, for example, in the concept of democracy, right? Like, because the Chinese elite state that they have their own version of democracy, and no one should be dictating their own conceptualization of democracy to the Chinese people, they are saying. And they have this idea in terms of human rights discussions and other discussions as well. And Chinese intellectuals, of course, actively contribute to the state's new discourse generation efforts, especially the mainstream Chinese scholars. And this goes in line, this process goes or is adapted to the international relations discipline and the creation of a Chinese School of International Relations. And the Chinese school, especially the mainstream Chinese school, aims to promote national identity formation and stabilize the existing Communist Party rule. And this way, they aim to contribute to China's positioning in the global system. So I claim that mainstream IR scholars, mainstream Chinese School of IR, is working together with the Chinese elite. And we see this in the relationship between the most prominent Chinese scholars and their relationship with the Chinese elites, because like Zhao Tingyang, Yan Xuetong, and Qin Yaqing, all of these have close relationship or close contacts with the ruling elite, with the CPC elite. So here I looked at three Chinese approaches: the Tianxia or all under heaven approach of Zhao Tingyang, the Tsinghua approach or moral realism of Yan Xuetong, and a relational world, the relational theory of world politics by Qin Yaqing. So with Tianxia, Zhao Tingyang proposes the resurrection of traditional Chinese philosophy and Chinese world order to apply it to the current era. So based on traditional Chinese philosophy, Zhao aims to evaluate the current international order. And unlike Yan Xuetong and Qin Yaqing and previously mentioned Western IR scholars, Zhao Tingyang is a philosopher, so he's not an IR scholar. So his position is different from all these scholars that we have been talking about. And the Tsinghua approach or the moral realism, and Yan Xuetong is the leading figure, states that to gain hegemonic status in the world economy or in world politics, a state needs to combine four aspects of power. So they are political, military, economic, and geographical power. And the key is political power. Therefore, this is called like his position is different from actually, even though his ideas are based on Western realism, so mainstream realist approaches, and Yan Xuetong rejects the idea that there can be non-universal knowledge production. He's a supporter of universalistic knowledge production, but his still approach is different from neorealism, which his ideas are based on. And Qin Yaqing very briefly states that relationality matters in international politics, and his ideas are, of course, as Yan Xuetong's and Zhao Tingyang's approaches, based on Chinese thought. And because like creating guanxis, like relations, networks are very important for the Chinese and for Chinese thinking since ages, Qin Yaqing says that we should be looking at the relations in between societies and in between states while evaluating the position of each state in the international system. For example, he gives this example. When we look at, he says, the position of the United States in terms of nuclear powers, we see that when the United States evaluates Britain's relationship with nuclear weapons, they do not oppose Britain acquiring nuclear weapons because they have a special relationship. But when we look at United States like evaluation of North Korea having a nuclear weapon or the possibility of Iran having a nuclear weapon, they do not want it because they see, the United States sees these two countries as an opponent or enemies. Therefore, we need to look at relations to understand the essence of the positions of each state in the international system, Qin Yaqing claims. And when we look at the mainstream Chinese conceptions of the idea of China rising, we see that they are trying to build a harmonious world through national rejuvenation. So harmonious world creation was the main idea of Hu Jintao period, and national rejuvenation or Chinese dream is the primary idea of the Xi Jinping period in the last, let's say, since 2002, so in the last 20 years. Finally, let's look at the critical and neoconservative Chinese conceptions of a rising China. These scholars are, they have highly different positions in terms of both their locations in world social sciences knowledge production, because when we go back to the initial part of the presentation, I said that we need to divide social sciences, or the structure of social sciences, into three: core, semi-periphery, and periphery. So core was represented by the United States, semi-periphery by Western European IR scholars, and periphery by the rest. So China in general is located in the periphery of social sciences. However, when we divide China's social sciences knowledge production structure into core and periphery, we see that mainstream IR scholars are representing the core of Chinese knowledge production, and these critical and neoconservative scholars, especially many of the ones that I evaluate in the book, are located in the periphery of the Chinese social sciences and humanities knowledge production, which means that they are located in the peripheries of the periphery. So the relationship with knowledge production, as well as their relationship with their ruling elites, are highly different from the mainstream Chinese scholars, as well as they are different from the Western critical IR scholars. So to give a very brief idea of the transformation of knowledge production efforts in China, we see that in the post-Maoist period, as the Chinese economy and society transformed, Chinese intellectual community transformed as well. And in this changing dynamic, Chinese intellectuals with different ideological backgrounds have been competing with each other in China's journey to rebuild a new identity. Because in the Maoist period, China, even though then there were different attempts to position China in the international system through different conceptualizations, in the post-Mao period, we see that with the transformation going on in China, both Chinese identity and its relations, so China's identification of itself, as well as its relations with the outside world, has changed. And different scholars with different perspectives or worldviews try to draw their own identity for China. So there are many other schools, but here in the book I focus on Chinese liberals, China's new left, and new Confucianists. But there are others like statists, nationalists, and some others as well, but I excluded the rest. So when we look at the liberal approaches, so they are against the Chinese state, but in the early opening up and reform period, so in the 1980s, liberals were linked to the state decision-making apparatuses very strongly. Up until the, let's say, late 90s or early 2000s, liberals, especially economic liberals, had strong relationship with the state elites. And they supported the neoliberal transformation of China in these years. But because they lack Chinese characteristics, so because their ideas are exclusively based on Western liberal approach, exclude actually liberals' ideas in the book. Even though I provided an overview, I did not go into details of Western or Chinese liberalism, because we are already used to the Western conceptualization of China. So when we look at the intellectuals and their position in China, so under Mao, we see that intellectuals primarily acted as servants of the state. Even though there were discussions going on about Chinese socialism, Mao's position in the system from time to time, primarily intellectuals were the servants of the state. But in the post-Mao era, we see that the relationship between the state and the intellectuals has changed. So the Communist Party no longer dominates contemporary public sphere as it used to during the Mao period, but instead it manages it. And because of that, Chinese intellectuals have a room to maneuver and from time to time criticize the policies adopted by the state. But we should be always keeping in mind that this is an authoritarian state controlled by one party. Therefore, Chinese intellectuals are not free from censorship and self-censorship. And because of that, we should be always keeping in mind that they are different from, or their position, their sensitivity is highly different from Western intellectuals. So they are public intellectuals with Chinese characteristics. And because of that, their characteristics, their position are shaped by politics and history and their relationship with the state. So I will briefly talk about New Left and Neo-Confucianism, and then move on to the concluding part to keep it shorter. So the Chinese New Left entered the intellectual stage in the early 1990s. They were criticizing, or they are still criticizing, rising inequality in the country, because this neoliberal transformation created the conditions for high inequality in the country. They talked about the transformation of the state, and they primarily criticized Tiananmen incidents, and some of them were active contributors of the Tiananmen incidents. In general, Chinese left are critical of capitalism and neoliberalism, but they don't have an intention of returning to Mao era policies. So they are not Maoists. There's another group of intellectuals and students, youth movement, which can be called as Maoists, but New Left are or can be defined more of social democrats or democratic socialists, let's say. They oppose, highly oppose to depoliticization of the country and the Occidentalist understanding of China and its claim for universal validity. And they are critical intellectuals that fight a discursive battle against sinological Orientalism as well. And unlike liberals, they do not view the state as their enemy. Actually, their primary goal has been to re-establish the efficiency and with this, the legitimacy of Chinese socialism. So they want to transform Chinese socialism to meet the needs of the 21st century of China. When we look at Neo-Confucianism, we see that from the early 1990s onwards, Confucianism in the mainland has experienced a renaissance. And it takes its inspiration not from Western world, but overwhelmingly from Chinese, traditional Chinese philosophy. So because of that, we can say that they are exclusively Chinese or have a Chinese background. And New Confucian scholars aim to find an essential and subjective Chinese way of legitimate governance, distinct from Western political orders, but they are highly critical of the Communist Party of China. So some of the scholars, for example, see the communist regime and the party as already a failed regime and failed party. Therefore, they do not engage in discussions with the socialists, and they talk to the liberals because they say that the future of the country will be decided not by socialists, or either by the liberals or by new Confucianists. Therefore, new Confucianism in China has been intensely political and is a deliberate movement towards the resignification or de-Westernization of China. And this way, they try to reduce China to Confucianism. So their approach is highly different from other Chinese scholars. So, in conclusion, I will very briefly talk about each approach and their position in this core-periphery structure and their relationship with the power structures. So we see that mainstream IR scholars are the ones who define hegemony. And this definition is the dominance of a great power over other states, and which prioritizes, and they also prioritize state security. And because they prioritize state security, they evaluate the rise of China as a matter of US security. Therefore, they talk about China either as a status quo power or a challenger power. So if it's a status quo power, it's a country will comply with the rules proposed by United States, so it will not be a challenge. If China is a challenger, then we need to deal with this challenge or threat to the Chinese security, mainstream IR scholars claim. When we look at the critical Western IR approaches, we see that as a consequence of their Western-centricity, they consider Western great powers as the only historical hegemonies. So, like Western world systems analysis, and this approach led by Wallerstein, so not by Andre Gunnar Frank or others. Like world systems analysis and Robert Cox and his historical materials critical approach exclusively focus on Western great powers as historical hegemonies. They willingly exclude other experiences, other, let's say, historical world systems or hegemons like pre-modernity China, etc. And this way, critical Western IR approaches strengthen the centrality of Western-centric knowledge production in the field, and they put the supremacy of the West in world political economy at the center of their analysis. And based on this, and based on the definition of hegemony provided by mainstream IR, critical Western approaches consider China as the main contender state against the United States and the liberal Western world order, as mainstream IR does. And this way, they think and write about China in terms defined by the orthodox thinking in the discipline, which is the mainstream IR thinking. And this way, critical Western IR approaches comply with the debates initiated by the status quo-oriented problem-solving mainstream IR theories. And even though they try to transcend this approach, they actually are stuck in the Western-centric problem-solving approach to the international system. When we look at the Tsinghua approach and moral realism, so one of the mainstream Chinese approaches, we see that it follows a similar path as well. So it openly endorses the scientificness and universality of knowledge production and favor the Westphalian state system as Western realism does. And it localizes knowledge and it localizes knowledge regarding the concept of hegemony and the debate on China, but it's benefits from this local knowledge provided by China to create a universalistic understanding of the world on Western-centric terms. So Tsinghua approach is a volunteer or a supporter of mainstream IR approaches in the world. When we look at the Tsinghua approach, we see that it questions the Western or Westphalian universality and claims that state-centrism needs to be abandoned, and instead the ancient Tianxia or all under heaven system needs to be adapted to the modern world system. So we need a Chinese approach to the modern world to understand how the modern world is structured. And this way it proposes an alternative ontology in understanding and explaining world affairs. And it suggests a Chinese version cosmopolitanism. And finally, it substitutes, and this way, the Western exceptionalism with Chinese exceptionalism. When we look at the critical and non-Western Western or Chinese approaches, we see that they have critical stances both towards both mainstream Western as well as mainstream Chinese perspectives. So they try to overcome Western centricity and bring in Chinese standpoints to the field. They differ from Western and mainstream Chinese approaches in their attempts to challenge the claimed universality of Western concepts. They redefine the concepts like modernity, legitimacy, and democracy in a way different from their Western usages. And this way they try to create heterogeneity in knowledge production. They try to propose alternative meanings to concepts commonly accepted as universal. And finally, with their efforts of indigenizing knowledge, non-mainstream Chinese scholars challenge other three clusters of scholars from the West as well as China. So they do not only challenge mainstream Western and mainstream Chinese perspectives, they also challenge non-mainstream Western perspectives as well. So they reject the challenge, they reject and challenge Western intellectual dominance and claims for universalism. They reclaim critical and non-Western centric discourse from critical Western scholars, and they reclaim the production and usage of more purist Chinese ideas from mainstream scholars like Yan Xuetong. And this is the end. Thank you for listening. I know it's like, I tried my best to keep it short, but it took longer than actually what we thought with Prokoja. But since this is the first book talk, I guess I was more, let's say, enthusiastic about trying to give as much as I can. But thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Emre. I mean, it was a very detailed presentation, but also a very well-organized one. So I think it was easy to follow the whole structure. Thanks so much. So now we can start the Q&A session. And if you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand and you can take the floor and ask. And if you want to submit a written question, again, you can use the Q&A box here on Zoom. You can start. I mean, I have a couple of questions, but let's wait first others. Okay, I'll ask a few starters. You know, you actually, oh, Kadir, please go first.
Okay, I have 3 questions, but they are related questions. Actually, the book generally examines the power configuration and knowledge production, but a little bit related and a little bit unrelated. But I would like to ask how states and other political actors, think tanks, and multinational corporations like actors use knowledge production to further their own interests and agendas. Is knowledge production play a role competition between China and United States? And what implications might competition in knowledge production have other nations and regions? These are my related questions, because the knowledge production is not far away from the states, actors, funds, think tanks. Do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, do you?
Shall I answer one by one, or?
Yeah, I mean, what do you prefer?
Okay, let's go on one by one. So maybe.
Okay.
So thank you very much for the question. It's based on this the relationship between power and knowledge production, and I want to repeat the question so that I want to see if I could get it right or wrong. So you asked that how states and other political actors like think tanks, international organizations, etc., further their own interests based on the knowledge produced by intellectuals, etc. I guess this was the question, to keep it short. So to keep the presentation short, I mean, I up to a degree answered the question in the book, but to keep it short, I did not focus on that part. But we can say, I mean, as I said, mainstream, for example, let's look at the mainstream mainstream Western IR scholars and their knowledge production. I say that they their main goal is to stabilize the international system and US lead in the international system, and they provide or they produce knowledge for that. And also they have a state-centric perspective, and they focus on state security. And this way, they evaluate China or another country like Russia in terms of status quo or challenging power configuration or spectrum, let's say. And with this, many of these elites either brief state elite, or they have positions in the government, like Joseph Nye. So they impact up to a degree on the policies or decisions taken and policies implemented by the countries. And when we look at this, for example, the concept of new Cold War, right? Because nowadays, in the last few years, but since 2 or 3 years, we have been talking about the idea of a new Cold War created or being established in the international system. We see that the primary producers of this knowledge are American scholars. Normally, I'm opposed to this idea of using Americans because of the concept of American, because the other parts of American continent, they criticize it, but to keep it brief, I will continue using that. So the American international relations scholars build this concept of new Cold War nowadays, and they by using it and by influencing the decision makers, actually they influence the decision taken by the countries. And when we look at this new Cold War rhetoric, for example, we see that since few years, in line with the knowledge production, the United States of America started to implement policies to create, first of all, a division between Western democracies or democracies in the world in general versus authoritarianism, which is claimed to be led by China and up to a degree Russia. So the process started with the Obama administration, then the Trump administration continued with the idea, but because it didn't have much to do with democracy, this democracy versus authoritarianism discourse was put aside, even though the policies were similar. And then we see that the Biden administration is based on what Obama administration and the Trump administration has done. And from this, and they, I mean, he's the champion, he's trying to make the United States as the champion of democracy again. And here we see that, like, by basing on the ideas proposed by intellectuals, either by international relations scholars, by think tankers, or by media figures, the United States is adopting its policies while trying to create this discourse. So the elite, ruling elite, and the international relations scholars, as well as think tankers, etc., are working together to contain China. And this way, I think, if I could answer your question, and this way the states use knowledge production to further their own interests. So this is my answer, or I hope it's the answer you were expecting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Emre. Aiko, please go ahead.
Hello, I'm Aiko Takeuchi Demerji. Thank you for your very fascinating and comprehensive talk. I have a question about the idea of regionalism. I'm wondering how that idea fits into all these debates and discussions and knowledge about world hegemony. And again, like when we talk about regionalism, in the end, we might end up basically replicating the same idea of who's being the leader of each region. But yet I'm wondering how in international relations, the idea of regionalism and at least this concept of the diffusion of power, how that fits into place.
Thank you very much for the questions. So we have two questions, one related with nationalism and how this fits into like the discussions on hegemony, and the other one is about regionalism and like region-centricity and the diffusion of power. So for the first one, nationalism is highly influential, actually, even though I do not like engage in a discussion about nationalism in the book. I can say that it's very important. And when we look at, for example, in the Chinese context, especially mainstream IR context, we see that like, so since the neoliberal transformation in China, like socialism, of course, lost ground. Like, I mean, even though the official rhetoric talks about socialism with Chinese characteristics and China being a socialist country still, and because it is, of course, governed by a communist party or the communist party, they cannot like leave aside this rhetoric, of course. But we see that socialism is no longer the idea that provides legitimacy to the country or to the ruling elite. And therefore, nationalism and previously like economic development provided these the legitimacy for the party. But more and more these days, nationalism or nationalism is getting or becoming much more important in these discussions and for the ruling elite to stabilize and legitimize their rule. And especially Zhao Tingyang and Yan Xuetong, for example, are highly nationalistic scholars. And they want to create the conditions for the rise of China, and if possible, to create the conditions for China creating hegemony in the world. And China is using nationalism card to get the support of their society in building this hegemony. And like, to take myself out of the discussion, I don't think that China can ever build a hegemony in the, like, if we define hegemony in terms of like, with an ideational background in a more Gramscian sense, let's say, or in the moral realism context of Yan Xuetong, I don't think they can ever build that. But the Chinese scholars, especially mainstream IR scholars, that try to help or that help their ruling elite to build hegemony, they are using nationalism very much. Therefore, nationalism plays a very important role in knowledge production in China, as well as in, actually, I think, mainstream Western IR scholars as well. I mean, without this nationalistic attitude, for example, John Mearsheimer would not be like supporting the idea of US centrality in the world order. So thank you very much for this contribution and question about this debate. And about the for the second question about regionalism, so I totally agree with you, actually, even though I didn't mention that, but because like I had a few slides to go, but I wanted to cut it because it was already too long in my presentation. So I didn't talk about it, but like primarily, like all these efforts of overcoming Western centrism should not be creating new regionalisms or new region-centricities or localities. So what I am proposing is not Sinocentrism or Indocentrism, Russocentrism, or any other kind of centrism, Afrocentrism, as opposed to Western centrism, but overcoming all these centrisms. But I don't know the exact way of overcoming this. And since today, for all the readings I've done, I couldn't see the best, let's say, solution to this problem. But maybe, I say, this heterogeneity, so diffusion of power in the world, as well as diffusion of knowledge production, might at least provide us other alternatives to create a more just order, so that we can overcome this like Western centricity and the claim of Western centric knowledge of universality. So because like Western centrism tries to present its locality as a universalistic approach or universal ideas, but maybe different like knowledge produced in different localities at least can show us that there are alternative ways of thinking about the world, and this way maybe we can overcome this imperialist, colonialist international structure. I say, thank you very much.
Thank you. Sinan, you have a question, I guess. Sinan Haskan, okay. Okay. I'll ask two questions then. First of all, you know, on page 17, you say, Chinese IR scholars are still, trying to engage with American, US IR scholars. Mm-hmm. And although they have some, there is some effort to link with IR scholars of, peripheral and, semi-peripheral regions, these efforts haven't been sufficient enough. Is this still the case? I mean, given the whole, huge engagement with the BRI and all that kind of, state Chinese government's orientation, is this still the case? The Chinese IR scholars still mainly engage with the Americans and do not engage with others enough. The second question is, again, on page 109, you basically discuss similarities between these different Chinese IR scholars. And you say for Yan Xuetong and for Yan and Huang, Chinese state should abandon, right, its non-alliance principle to become a more sort of influential, more effective sort of actor. This is a very important issue. And they, and you say they also present Xi Jinping's policies, probably including BRI, yeah, in this direction. So the China is, you know, gradually abandoning this non-alliance principle and tries to sort of establish its own set of alliances, right? So can you elaborate on these 2 points, you know, both Chinese dropping of this non-alliance principle, second, Chinese IR scholarships engagement with the semi-peripheral and peripheral regions? These are my questions. So
okay, Hocam. And at the same time, Sinan Askan said that he cannot unmute himself. Maybe he can also, like, in the meantime, write his own, his question in the Q&A.
Okay.
And I will try to answer these 2 questions. So I'll start with the first question. So Chinese IR scholars engaging with Western IR. Especially for Yan Xuetong, I think that that's still the case, actually. So maybe and Qin Yaqing also. Maybe it's up to a degree. It's related. It's also the case with Zhao Tingyang, but because he's not an IR scholar, his position is a bit different because he's a philosopher and he is trying to avoid engaging in like day-to-day discussions, at least openly. Because Yan Xuetong is saying that China should be abandoning the non-alliance principle. He should be like constructing different types of relationships with United States, with other countries in his numerous writings and interviews, etc. But I think that especially Yan Xuetong and up to a degree Qin Yaqing, they still try to engage with Western IR. So their ideas are based on Western IR theories. Yan Xuetong says that I am a realist and we cannot have, let's say, like non-universal theories. Theories are always universal and it needs to be, it should be, they should be adapted to all, let's say, different cases. So he is totally in line with what neorealism, for example, claims. Therefore, I think that he still tries to engage with Western IR, but while also proposing like policy guidance and alternatives to its own, or to his own state and state elite. It's hard to say that we know that, but we hear that, or we did that he has strong ties with the foreign policy making elite in the country. So by using Western concepts, intellectually, he is engaging in discussions with Western scholars, but also proposing policy options to his superiors, let's say, in the Chinese state. So he is doing both, I think, in this sense. And about the other one, so abandoning the non-alliance principle. His case is, I think, is the best case for, showing us that there's a strong relationship between the Chinese mainstream scholars and the Chinese state. As I said, he's known to be actively engaged in policy making, or at least giving policy advice to them. And this like idea of abandoning non-alliance principle is an important part. But I don't think for the moment we see that his advice is taken into account much, because like numerous times Wang Yi and like other like state officials said that they have no idea, that they have no intention of abandoning this principle, and because they don't have an idea of, or they don't have an aim of establishing hegemony, either in the Western sense or in the like moral realist sense. So I don't think China will soon abandon this principle, even though Yan Shuitong wants the country to do it a lot, because he wants the country to become the next hegemon, actually, based on morality, not like, let's say, not following the US example or the British example, but he wants China to create moral hegemony based on political power, supported by like economic and productive capacities, let's say, of the country. But I don't think the country will change that soon, because when we, for example, look at the writings of some Gramscian scholars, because there are some others, and since Hocam, you asked me a question from this third chapter, or like from the moral, from the mainstream Chinese ones, you already like read the previous chapter. So there, because China is like cannot attract especially developed countries, they say that the likelihood of China creating hegemony is very low. And if China abandons this non-alliance principle, then the possibility of China allying with like these strong powers, let's say in economic terms and military terms, is like the likelihood is very small, with the exception of Russia. Russia wants more of like Chinese official support, while China is trying to actually like shy away from this support officially, at least. I think the Chinese leadership is seeing this. They are investing hugely on African elite. Let's say they're investing in African elite. They're trying to get the support of Africans. They provide like thousands of scholarships, but having the support of Africa, for example, or Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, would not provide China the position of hegemony, world hegemony, it seems. So I don't think they will abandon it in the short term.
Thank you. Sinan?
Hocam, I hope you can hear me. I am out right now, unfortunately, but nevertheless, I hope you can hear me well. As I understand your study and perfect presentation, first of all, I want to thank for that. As I understand from your presentation, Professor, China wants to make a paradigmatic shift in evaluation about hegemonic competition and the concept of hegemony. But nevertheless, in terms of rise of China, if we evaluate this process in terms of world system theory, there is an unchanged point, which was financial power in terms of becoming an hegemon in the world system. If China wants to be a hegemon in the world system, its financial power must be dominate than United States. But China and China's governing system is an is communist system, but nevertheless, we can say there is no change in terms of becoming hegemon. How can China succeed such an transforming? Otherwise, in terms of paradigmatic points, there is no change actually. Do you agree with me?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. We could hear you very well. So you say that China wants to make a paradigmatic change in defining hegemony and becoming a hegemonic power. But according to world systems analysis, financial power is very important in creating hegemony. So how can China succeed in doing this?
Sorry, I want to make some contribution actually. Since if we evaluate becoming hegemon in terms of world system theory, rising powers' main economic activity is industrial developments, but hegemonic powers' economic activity is financial activities. In terms of this, there is no change actually, but can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
But actually, that's all. That's all. What I want to say.
Okay, thank you. To make it, I mean, to detail a bit more. So, in terms of world systems analysis, or in terms of what Wallerstein claims, because there are different perspectives in world systems approach as well. So, a country should be dominating first or leading agro-industrial production first, then trade, and then finance to build an hegemony. Like only all these three, let's say, parts of economy are led by a country, that country can create hegemony, according to Wallerstein. And because of this, actually, he's criticized for being like economics oriented. So the thing is, so the first part of the question and the second part of the question are a bit different or conflicting. So if we are to evaluate China's rise and possibility of being a hegemon from world systems approach and take it as the main like approach to be evaluating any country in the world, yes, we can say that China is leading agro-industrial production, it is leading the world in trade terms, but it is still way behind the United States in terms of financial leadership. And in that sense, yes, you are right, China cannot establish hegemony, at least for the moment, because of this lack of leadership in financial production. And we can add dominance in military terms as well to this. But if we say that China wants to make a paradigmatic change in defining hegemony, then we shouldn't be focusing our attention on world systems analysis definition of hegemony, because the Chinese are trying to propose both, like especially the mainstream scholars, mainstream Chinese scholars, are offering different ways of defining hegemony. Especially when we look at like what Zhao Tingyang, without using the concept of hegemony, and what Qin Yaqing proposes are different from this economic-oriented like hegemony definition of hegemony. Also like moralism of Yan Xuetong as well, because it's based on political power. Therefore, if China wants, and like we shouldn't be taking it as China, because like what I'm trying to show in the book is that actually there are different approaches in the world, like based like the different countries have different approaches to the concept of hegemony or to the international system, but in each country there are different versions or different perspectives. Therefore, we shouldn't be using China wants to make this or China wants to make that, but some scholars in China, yes, want to make paradigmatic change in defining hegemony or China's position in the international system. But if they want to make this paradigmatic change, then they shouldn't be focusing on what world systems analysis proposed to all of us, right? And their definitions are highly different from the Westerners. But some scholars are trying to make a paradigmatic change, but as I said before, like Yan Xuetong, for example, has no intention of creating a paradigmatic change in defining hegemony, while Zhao Tingyang and Qin Yaqing have. So we will see if China or Chinese scholars can make this paradigmatic change, but to be able to like accomplish this change or to be able to succeed, first of all, they need to take out like Chinese social sciences production from the periphery and move towards the core. And what actually Chinese mainstream IR scholars are trying to do is this. They are trying to move from the periphery to the core parts of the social sciences knowledge production structure. But critical Chinese scholars have no such desire. And as I said before, they are already located in the peripheries of the periphery. So when we are using these like the country names or like China doing this, United States doing this, we need to be aware of this like heterogeneity in knowledge production, and trying to we try to understand, and this is my aim. I'm trying to still understand. I'm reading Chinese intellectuals still, different of them to the ones I can like reach to actually. But like this way, I'm trying to understand what a different intellectual groups are proposing first to their own countrymen or people, not men, like for their own like society, the ruling elite, and to the world. But it's not hard to make this. It's very hard to accomplish this paradigmatic change, and we will see if they can achieve that in the future.
Any other questions or comments from the audience? Okay. Okay, then. So, Emre, thanks so much for this.
Thank you very much, Hocam.
Fascinating presentation. And also, I would like to thank our participants for asking very interesting questions. And so we are coming to the end of our webinar. And have a good day, and see you in our other webinars, in our future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.